This is the Pulsar Xlite Crazylight, Pulsar's second entry into the Crazylight series, which aims to offer the same weight-optimized experience that we saw in the X2 Crazylight, just in an ergonomic shell with top-of-the-line specs. Now on paper, this mouse seems almost too good to be true for ergo lovers like myself, as not only does the Xlite Crazylight have the same top-of-the-line specs as the X2 Crazylight, it also comes in a lightweight design, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the lightest ergo mouse currently available on the market. And given how impressive the X2 CL was, even though it wasn't perfect, my expectations for this mouse were very high, but in reality, this mouse is indeed too good to be true, as while the majority of the mouse is good, Pulsar's design methodology has stumbled here yet again, as several aspects of the mouse are quite underwhelming. This makes the Xlite CL a very odd mouse, as while it's lighter than the standard versions of the Xlite, its performance and particularly its battery life is far worse than competitors' offerings, and even the standard versions of the Xlite. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to take a deep dive and talk all about the pros and cons of Pulsar's latest entry in the Crazylight series. But before we get into it, big thank you to Pulsar for sending the Xlite Crazylight over for review, and if you want to see more videos like this, including a full teardown of the Xlite Crazylight, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you want to support what I do here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and of course the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a member gives you early access to all upcoming episodes of the mel0n Review and Teardown. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the Xlite Crazylight for about 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use on various soft and hard pad types. For sensitivity range, I used my normal range of 40 to 50 cm per 360, and since the mouse includes 2 types of stock skates, I used both of these skate types over my testing, as well as some aftermarket skates. For firmware, I tested the Xlite on the 3.03 firmware, the latest version available at the time of this review, and since the Xlite uses a PAW3950 sensor, which finally allows for sensor tilting, I utilized a -4° tilt on the sensor over my testing. For versions, the Xlite Crazylight is currently available in 2 colorways: the jet black colorway, which features a black shell and black buttons, and a white colorway, which features a white shell with white buttons. Now, since the mouse was just released, I assume Pulsar will be releasing additional colorways and special editions for the Xlite Crazylight in the near future, just as they have done with the X2 CL. And for pricing, the mouse retails for $129.95 USD, which is around $179.99 Canadian dollars, the same pricing we saw used for the X2 Crazylight. For unboxing, the Xlite comes in the traditional Pulsar style box we've seen them use for many of their mice, including the original Xlite, which has just been updated with the Crazylight's branding. I also wanted to highlight that Pulsar's product boxes have improved a lot, as the box not only gives you a lot of information about the mouse itself along with its advertised weight and its features, it also provides an estimate of what grip styles will work with the mouse, and additionally it also has a scannable QR code that links to the Xlite software, which is a great attention to detail. Inside the box we find the Xlite itself, which is held in place by a plastic frame and a small foam pillar on the underside of the box top. Now the mouse comes with full-size PTFE skates pre-installed on its base, which do have a blue protective film over them, so be sure to remove this film prior to using the mouse. Now removing this plastic frame under the mouse, we'll find the accessory package, which we'll talk about in a moment, and under a cardboard flap at the top of the box you'll find the Xlite's dongle, which is the same style dongle as the one used for the X2 CL and the X2F, but this version is slightly different though, as it has a transparent white shell and the expected rubber base, which does keep the dongle pretty well anchored on most desktop surfaces. Another noteworthy feature I noticed about this dongle that I haven't noticed before is that Pulsar has added a small metal weight inside the dongle to make it slightly heavier. I assume they've done this on their other more recent releases as well, but those dongles had solid shells so I never noticed this, but regardless, this is a nice attention to detail. Now circling back to the accessory package we removed earlier, inside we'll find the rest of the Xlite's accessories, the first of which is a USB A to C cable, which in typical Pulsar style has a tilted USB-C end, which is great to see, but this stock cable is rather stiff and a lot less flexible than Pulsar's previous cables, but we'll talk more about this later. Next we have a small little folio which includes a Crazylight themed sticker, an Xlite card, and a set of 12 dot skates which are made out of ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, or UHMWPE for short. Now given their material, these dots are optimized for hard pad use, which is a great accessory to see included here. However, the skate's performance and their shaping is rather odd to say the least, but we'll talk more about these later. The mouse also includes a pretty comprehensive user manual which gives a thorough breakdown of the mouse's features and how to adjust the settings via the onboard controls, how to install and place the included MWPE dot skates, and much more. But most importantly, the manual shows instructions for removing the mouse's battery for recycling, which is great to see as very few brands include disassembly instructions. Unfortunately though, the mouse doesn't include any grip tapes or an extra set of full-size PTFE skates, which would have been nice to see included, but this is a pretty minimal nitpick considering the stock skates are so good and the Xlite's coating performed quite well. And lastly, for warranty, the Xlite Crazylight has a 2-year warranty, and you can find all the terms and conditions for said warranty over on Pulsar's website. For in-game performance, the Xlite Crazylight is an impressive mouse in some respects, as the mouse's build quality and performance was good, especially since Pulsar finally added support for sensor tilting, a feature that has been missing from their mice for several months now despite their mice using the 3950 sensors. But in an effort to make the mouse lighter and more applicable to the Crazylight branding, Pulsar has opted to release the Xlite Crazylight in the size 1 or mini size, not the medium or large size that the standard Xlites come in. Now this was expected as they did the same thing with the X2CL, however the X2CL being a symmetrical mouse is more flexible with its grip compatibility, whereas an ergo shape like the Xlite is not. So I found myself struggling to use the mouse due to my larger hands and its smaller size, but thankfully I was able to use a very aggressive claw grip with the mouse, which did help with its overall usage. Now aside from its smaller size, as I said before, the mouse does perform quite well, however the scroll wheel encoder is very loose, which makes the wheel less optimized for some use cases. The mouse is also capped to 1 GHz on its wire connectivity, just like the X2CL, which while not a major issue is a little disappointing, and the mouse's battery life was very poor compared to competitors' mice and Pulsar's own mice, and the stock cable and the included MWPE dots were very underwhelming, but I'll talk more about these aspects later. Another odd thing about this mouse I noticed is that the dongle LED is extremely bright, and for some reason the light's default behavior is that when there is motion the LED is on, but if there's no motion for a couple seconds the light will turn off, and then it turns back on when movement is detected, which makes the dongle very distracting since it's so bright. Now thankfully this behavior can be adjusted via the WebDriver, but it was definitely an issue at first as it is very distracting. But nonetheless, the performance I had here on the Xlite CL was good, but again in typical Pulsar style, while there are a lot of positives to this mouse, there are many caveats to the mouse's usage experience which makes this mouse rather odd, so much so I questioned whether the weight reduction is even worth the price, as the standard versions of the Xlite, while heavier, seem to be the better buy as they have better scroll wheel encoders and much better battery, and these standard versions also come in 3 sizes, the mini, the medium, and the large size. Now for build quality and QC, as a precursor to this section, keep in mind that my Xlite Crazylight was shipped to me directly from Pulsar, so take my unit's build quality and QC with a grain of salt, especially given Pulsar's history with their products QC. Now first off, for build quality, my Xlite Crazylight feels solid, being on the same level as the X2CL in terms of quality, as the mouse's shell is quite rigid with no notable creaking or flexing anywhere on the top or base shells. For QC, despite Pulsar's history, this Xlite is perfect, as the main clicks feel great and have no inconsistencies in their actuation or click feel. The side buttons also feel quite good. They are a little poppy in their feeling, but they have a good click feel nonetheless. But as I mentioned earlier, the scroll wheel's encoder is very loose, making the wheel very easy to misactuate or over scroll, but we'll talk more about this later. For weight, given the mouse's name and size, the Xlite Crazylight is a more optimized mouse compared to the standard iterations of the Xlite. Now Pulsar is advertising that this mouse will weigh around 43 grams in its stock configuration and around 41 grams with the included dot skates. However, across the Xlite CL's branding, the 41 gram weight is front and center, but once you look a little closer you'll see the mouse's true stock weight listed in the fine print. But regardless of this less than accurate weight advertisements, my Xlite CL and its stock stock configuration weighs 44.6 grams, which is 1.6 grams heavier than advertised, and when using 8 of the included dot skates on the mouse, it weighs 42.6 grams, again 1.6 grams heavier than Pulsar's advertised weight, and without any skates the mouse weighs 42.3 grams. So despite Pulsar's advertising, with both stock skates and dot skates, the mouse will be about 1.6 grams heavier than advertised, which does technically fall within the industry standard of plus minus 2 grams, but Pulsar is only advertising a plus minus 1 gram ratio here on the Crazylight, adding further inaccuracy to their advertised weight specs. Now in my opinion, the fact that they're using their marketing to allude to the Crazylight weighing 41 grams by putting that weight front and center on the mouse's advertisements, while the mouse really weighs about 44.6 grams in its stock configuration, is crazy work, pardon the pun, and because of this I'd love to see Pulsar update their marketing to better convey the true weight of the Xlite Crazylight. But regardless of the inaccurate weight advertisements here, the Crazylight's true weight is still quite impressive, as it's about 7.4 grams lighter than the Xlite Mini V3 and V4, while having similar-ish performance and still a solid build quality, which is quite impressive. And just like the X2 Crazylight, the Xlite feels great to use, and to date I think it's the lightest ergo mouse I've personally used, and while the weight is by all means totally fine for an ergo mouse, I do wish Pulsar was a little more honest with the mouse's true weight. For balancing, the Xlite Crazylight is centrally balanced, being balanced ever so slightly forward of the mouse's 57.8mm midline, roughly at the 58.4mm mark measured from the base of the shell, matching the location of the mouse's sensor. But interestingly though, the Xlite does have a slight balancing range to it, but instead of the balancing range being centered on the mouse's balancing point, this range extends towards the rear of the shell, ranging from the 58.4mm mark to around the 55.8mm mark on my unit, roughly ranging from the middle point of the forward side button to about the halfway point of the rear side button. Now this slight range does give a bit of flexibility to the Xlite's hand and grip style compatibility, which will be most noticeable with small to medium sized hands, not so much with larger hands like mine, and while I couldn't really utilize this balancing range due to my larger hand size, it's still a nice feature to see here on the Xlite Crazylight. Another noteworthy aspect to the Xlite's balancing is that despite its ergonomic shape, the mouse is still evenly balanced on its Y-axis, so despite the taller left side, the mouse doesn't have any particular bias to the left or right side, which is especially important on smaller ergonomic mice like the Crazylight. It's also worth mentioning that if you use the Xlite wired specifically with the stock cable, you might notice that it makes some movements feel a little forward heavy, not by a very large margin, but with some movements you might notice they feel a little heavier. With lighter, more flexible cables like the one included with the older Pulsar X2 series mice, this isn't an issue as much, but if you use the mouse wired with its stock cable, it will make the mouse feel a little forward heavy, so keep this in mind. For shaping, since this is the size 1 or mini version of the Xlite, this mouse would be a little smaller than a traditionally sized ergo mouse. Now for length, the mouse measures 115.6mm long. For width, at the front region of the mouse, at its base, the shell is approximately 53.8mm wide, and at the top it measures approximately 58.2mm wide. At the mid region of the shell, at the base, the shell is approximately 57.1mm wide, and at the top it measures approximately 58.9mm wide, but in the upper mid region of the shell there is a heavy indentation in the side shell, and that is thinner than the rest of the shell, measuring only 52.9mm wide, and at the end region of the shell, at the base, the shell is around 63.4mm wide, and at its top it's around 55.5mm wide. For height, measured on the left and right sides of the Xlite's ergonomic shell, at the top region the shell's right side is approximately 24.6mm tall, while the left side is around 27.2mm tall. At the mid region of the shell's right side is around 35.5mm tall, while the left side is 40.7mm tall, and at the rear region of the shell's right side is approximately 26.8mm tall, while the left side is around 27.6mm tall. For shell profiles, looking at the Xlite from the top, we can see the expected ergonomic shaping, where the raised left side of the shell tapers downward to the right, creating the typical ergonomic curvature. We can also see the side shell curvature has an indented left side and a flatter right side with a traditional rounded end on the rear region of both side shells. Flipping the mouse over to look at the base, we can better see the shell's side profile, and we can also best see the indented left side right from the top, which peaks much higher than we commonly see, with its deepest point resting resting around the 79.3mm mark, around 21mm forward of the mouse's physical midline, and towards the end of the left side shell profile, we see the very pronounced rounded flare out, which is expected for an ergonomic shape. On the shell's right side left from the top, we can see the expected flatter profile towards its top region, but it does curve outward towards the mid region and widens towards the end, having the same rounded flare out at its base, similar to the left side, just less pronounced. From the sides, we can best see the Xlite's upper shell profile and hump design, which, as expected for an ergonomic mouse, the hump is centrally focused, but interestingly, the hump peaks slightly forward of the mouse's physical midline, roughly at the 58.4mm mark. And from the hump's peak, the shell slopes more aggressively towards the front region of the mouse, while the slope towards the rear region of the mouse is much more gradual, creating that large, slightly curved contact area commonly seen on many ergo mice. Looking from the front, we can best see the aforementioned ergonomic tilt in the Xlite shell, with the raised left side right from the front that aggressively tapers down towards the right side of the shell. Again, the expected curvature we see on an ergonomic shape, just a little more aggressive here on the Xlite. From the front, we can also see the shaping of the Xlite's sides, as the left side of the shell right from the front is quite outwardly tilted and rounded at the top, and it flattens out towards the midpoint of the side shell curvature and dips in where the indentation is, and then inverts to be outwardly tilted towards the rear shell. Whereas on the right side left from the front, it is also outwardly tilted and rounded, just not as much as the left side, and this roundness flattens out towards the shell's mid region and inverts to be inwardly tilted towards the end region. Lastly, looking from the rear, we can again see the ergonomic tilt of the Xlite shell, with the taller left side and shorter right side as mentioned earlier, and as we mentioned earlier, the rear curvature is very gradual, creating a large sloping contact surface typical of most ergonomic mice. For contact areas from my 24.7 by 10.16 cm hands using a tilted aggro claw grip here in the Xlite Crazylight, starting with palm contact, the upper mid region of my thenar makes contact with the upper region of the left side shell's rounded rear profile, resting almost against the side of the mouse, while my upper mid palm region makes contact with the lower edge of the shell's hump, slightly behind the peak of it, and all regions of my hypothenar made contact with the lower region of the right side shell profile, resting against and on top of the right side shell's rounded rear flare out. For finger contact, my thumb naturally rests towards the upper region of the left side shell's indentation, but if needed I can tilt it inward to rest at the lower region of the indentation. While my index and middle fingers rest towards the top region of the shell buttons right at their center as the grooves in the shell buttons guide them there, my ring finger rests towards the upper region of the mouse's right side profile, and my pinky rests just below that, specifically below the transition point where the shell starts to widen slightly. For the estimated hand size and grip style compatibility here for the Xlite, Pulsar themselves is advertising that the mouse is best suited for palm grips, but since this is the mini size of the Xlite, this won't be the case for all hand sizes, and keep in mind that because the shells are ergonomic, not symmetrical like the X2 Crazylight, the mouse is only usable with right-handed grip styles. Now for small hands measuring approximately 19.7 by 8.3 cm, the mouse is best suited for palm grips. For medium hands measuring approximately 20.3 by 8.9 cm, the mouse will be best suited for palm and maybe claw grips. For large hands measuring approximately 21 by 9.5 cm, the mouse is again best suited for palm and claw grips. For extra large hands measuring approximately 21.6 by 10.2 cm, the mouse is best suited again for claw grips and possibly fingertip grips. And lastly, for extra large hands measuring approximately 22.2 by 10.8 cm, the mouse will be best suited for aggro claw grips and maybe fingertip grips. But while you can use a fingertip grip here on the Xlite, the ergonomic shape does make this grip style feel quite awkward, and if you prefer a fingertip grip but want a lighter mouse, I'd recommend getting the X2 Crazylight, as its asymmetrical shell is much better suited for fingertip grips, whereas the Xlite shell is much more optimized for claw and palm grips. But as always, this is a rough estimate, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility here for the Xlite will vary from person to person, so if you're considering the Xlite Crazylight, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your fingers to just below your wrist line, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your palm, excluding your thumb, and you can use those measurements to see if your hand size and your grip style will be compatible here with the Xlite Crazylight. Next, let's talk about coating. Now, the white Xlite Crazylight has a coating similar to the one found on the X2 CL, with the same chalky feel and a slight touch of rubberization to it. Comparing it to other coatings, this coating is chalkier than the coating found on the white Viper V3 Pro and Death Adder V4 Pro, and it feels more akin to the black G Pro Superlight V2's coating. Now, to the touch, the coating definitely has a fine grit kind of chalkiness to it. However, it's grippy enough that you don't need to use grip tapes, and with both wet and dry hands, you should be able to to anchor your hands on the Xlite shell without any issues in most use cases. But it is worth noting that just like all great coatings, the black colorway, just like the black coating we saw in the X2CL, does attract dust and debris and oils from your hand like a magnet does metal, so the mouse will have a grimy look to it unless you clean it frequently with a microfiber cloth. Because of this, if you are particular about your mouse's appearance, I'd avoid getting the black or other darker colorways of the Xlite Crazylight, as the shell will show more grime than the lighter white colorways will. But if you dislike the fine grip feeling of the Xlite's coating, you can always use aftermarket grips such as the X-Ray Cicadas or Gecko grips, as both of those grip tapes will make the mouse even easier to grip without having that semi-gritty, chalky feel to them. For the Xlite's main clicks, the mouse unsurprisingly shares the same click design as the normal versions of the Xlite, with the same wider shell buttons that are curved to match the forward shell curvature. These shell buttons also have the aforementioned grooving, which runs from the top to mid region of the buttons, and as expected, this indentation is the deepest towards the top of the shell buttons, where most fingers traditionally rest, and as I mentioned earlier, these grooves are pronounced enough where they naturally guide my fingers to the center of the shell buttons, but this guidance will lessen towards the mid region of the shell buttons, and at the top of the buttons there is no grooving or indentation there, so there will be no guidance in this region. Another great aspect to the main click's design is that they use the same coating as the rest of the Xlite shell, which means you can anchor your fingers on the main clicks in most if not all circumstances. It's also worth noting that despite the ergonomic shell, the Xlite's main clicks are quite well stabilized with only a slight degree of play to either button, even when actuated, and they are also indented into the shell, which is particularly important on an ergo mouse, and this indentation prevents any click interference on either of the main clicks, even with more forward grip styles. Now, due to the ergonomic shell, the buttons here on the Xlite do have different click heights, as the left button measures approximately 22.4mm tall at its end region, 30.2mm tall at its mid region, and around 39.4mm at its top region. Whereas the right button measures approximately 18.1mm tall at its end region, approximately 27.2mm tall at its mid region, and approximately 33.9mm at its top region. In terms of click audio, the main clicks do have a distinct audio sound to them, and here's a quick sound test of the main clicks. Inside, Pulsar is again using the FE optical switches here, the same style that was used on the X2 Crazylight with the same 100 million cycle rating. Now for those of you who haven't used FE switches before, these switches are very similar to mel0n optical switches, just with a slightly different click feel and a different audio feedback to them. Now for actuation weight, both the main clicks on the Xlite have the average actuation feel, being around the 55 to 56 gram force range towards the mid to end region of the shell buttons, but this actuation weight will increase slightly to the 60 to 70 gram force range towards the top region of the buttons. For travel, both the main clicks have a low to medium range of pre-travel and a medium to long range of post-travel, as the switches have a bit more over-travel than expected to them. Thankfully though, these FE switches do have a strong snappy rebound, which keeps the main clicks surprisingly spammable despite their longer travel ranges. And one great detail about these main clicks is that the stabilizers on the inside of the mouse are factory lubed, which is a nice touch, and despite the FE switches being optical switches, Pulsar is still using a debounce filter on the mouse, just as it did on the X2 Crazylight, and by default it's set to 2 milliseconds, but you can adjust this via the WebDriver if needed. For side buttons, unlike the rounded pill-shaped buttons Pulsar used on the X2CL, the Xlite uses much larger rectangular buttons with rounded corners, very similar in their design to the shape of the side buttons Razer uses on the Death Adder series mice. Now because this is a mini version, the buttons are on the smaller side, but they do have a large flattened surface area, which makes them quite easy to grip and actuate, and Pulsar has added a small gap between the side buttons, which is intended to prevent misactuating the opposite button when clicking the buttons on their inner edges, which is a nice attention to detail. Now for positioning, the side buttons are positioned more forward in the shell than expected, ahead of the mouse's 57.8mm physical midline, matching the peak of the shell's hump at around the 58.4mm mark, and the buttons are also slightly curved, which I assume was done to complement the hump's curvature, or just to make the buttons a little easier to access. Another great detail about these side buttons is that not only do they share the same coating as the rest of the mouse's shell, they are also quite pronounced in the mouse's side shell, so despite their smaller size, this prominence makes the buttons quite easy to actuate. In addition to their more pronounced nature, the side buttons are also quite well stabilized, with the buttons only having a slight degree of play to them even when actuated. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Xlite Crazylight side buttons. Inside, the Xlite Crazylight uses a familiar switch, the TTC brown shell blue dot switches, the same type of switch that was used for the X2CL side buttons. Now Pulsar isn't advertising a rating for these switches, but since these are the same switches we saw in the Hitscan Hyperlight and the G-Wolves HTS Ultra, I'm going to assume these switches have the same 5 million cycle rating. However, this is just an estimate and it may be a little lower, more around the 3 million cycle range. For actuation weight, and as expected for this switch, the side buttons have a higher actuation weight than the main clicks, feeling around a 70 to 80 gram force. This does make them feel a little unbalanced compared to the main clicks, but not in a super noticeable degree. For travel, the side buttons have a very slight range of pre-travel and a low to medium range of post-travel, with a slight degree of over-travel depending on how hard you actuate the side buttons. And while the rebound isn't as snappy as the FD opticals used for the main clicks, these TTC switches are strong enough in their rebound to keep the side buttons decently spammable despite their heavier actuation weight. Now for its scroll wheel, the Xlite, due to its design, is quite different from previous Crazylight mice despite its on-paper appearance, as the Xlite not only uses a different wheel design but also a new encoder and a new switch type. But before we talk about the internal differences, let's talk about the wheel itself, which is the traditional Pulsar style wheel made of plastic with a rubber texturing wrapped around it. This texturing on the wheel is the same as it was in the X2 Crazylight, with that linear studded design that is quite easy to grip. However, the wheel itself is much bigger than the one we've seen on the X2CL due to the larger ergonomic shell, which makes the wheel much more pronounced from the mouse's top shell, making it even easier to use and giving it a full scroll range. Now inside the mouse, instead of the Pulsar blue encoder that Pulsar used on the X2CL and many of their recent releases, the Xlite uses a much taller encoder, a TTC 13mm gold dustproof encoder, which is unfortunately a downgrade from the Pulsar blue encoder, as this encoder is very loose with very light rotational force and a very weak scroll point, which makes the wheel very easy to over scroll and misactuate, especially when trying to click the scroll wheel's click. The best analogy I can give for how this scroll wheel feels is that it feels as loose and uncontrollable as a fully worn encoder, like the F-switch encoder I have in my Keychron M2 that I've been using for almost 2 years. Now this is not the kind of wheel you want to have on a brand new mouse, and this means that over long-term use this scroll wheel is going to wear and become even looser, which is quite unfortunate. Now aside from the disappointing encoder, the Xlite also uses a very unique switch for its scroll wheel click, a switch I actually have never seen until now. Now generally speaking, TTC makes most of these unique scroll wheel switches, but unfortunately Pulsar wouldn't confirm the manufacturer, so I'm just going to assume it's a TTC switch. But despite the unknown manufacturer, this wheel click switch is very heavy with a similar 70 to 80 gram force actuation weight to it as the side buttons, which makes the wheel click a little awkward to utilize, and because the encoder is so weak and with how much pressure you have to apply to the wheel to scroll wheel click, I found myself accidentally scrolling quite frequently. The only exception to this is if you press on the sweet spot on the scroll wheel where it won't scroll, but during gaming use you're not going to take time to find this sweet spot on the wheel, you just want to click the wheel as soon as possible, which means there was a lot of inconsistencies with the scroll wheel during my testing, which was a major issue. But when I was able to use the wheel properly, I will say the scroll wheel click was fine. The rebound as expected was quite underwhelming, but this is pretty par for the course for most scroll wheel switches nowadays. Now, as expected for a Pulsar mouse, the Xlite Crazylight uses Pulsar's XS1 sensor, which is just a renamed PA3950, specifically the PA3950 DM-T5QU SKU. This sensor is positioned ever so slightly forward of the mouse's 57.8mm midline at roughly the 58.4mm mark, centered on the upper edge of the mouse's balancing range. Now, since this sensor is positioned ever so slightly forward, this forward quote-unquote sensor doesn't noticeably impact the mouse's performance in any way from my experience, but with other grip styles or hand sizes you might notice a slight difference because of it. Now the sensor itself is a fairly traditional 3950 implementation, but with some twists, as it has a max DPI of 32,000, 2,000 DPI higher than traditional 3950s, which is adjustable in increments of 10 DPI. The sensor also has the expected 3 LOD levels, 0.71 and 2 millimeters, and it also supports ripple, angle snapping, and motion sync, which can be enabled or disabled via the software. And as I mentioned earlier, a long overdue setting that is finally enabled here on the XS1 is sensor tilting, which was absent on the X2 Crazylight, and you can use this feature to tilt the sensor by 30 degrees in both left and right, and this is a great feature for people like myself who use an angled grip style, as you can match the angle of the sensor to the angle of your wrist, which means that your physical movements translate to in-game movements much more smoothly. And if you're unsure of your grip angle, Razer has a great tool on their website that tells you the angle of your grip, and I'll have that tool linked down in the video description for you to check out. And lastly, for the MCU, Pulsar is still using the Nordic NRF52840 MCUs, which to be fair are fine. However, since the NRF52H20 SKUs are finally hitting the market, it would have been nice to see Pulsar update the mouse's SoC to the newer, much more power efficient MCU, but it looks like I'll be waiting a little longer for Pulsar to adapt Nordic's new SoC. Now for connectivity, the Xlite Crazylight supports two connectivity modes, wireless 2.4 GHz and wired via its USB-C port. But unfortunately, just like the X2 CL, while the Xlite supports 125Hz to 8000Hz via its 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity, it's capped to 125Hz to 1000Hz on its wired connectivity, which is quite disappointing, but expected given that the other Crazylight series mice also don't support this. But hopefully on future revisions of the Crazylight mice, we see 8K wired polling enabled. But despite the limited polling rate options on wire connectivity, all the supported polling rates here in the Xlite were very well implemented as expected for a Pulsar mouse, and the polling rates performed perfectly in every game I tested the Xlite Crazylight in. For battery, the Xlite Crazylight uses the same 200mAh battery as the X2 CL, which is expected given the mouse's weight optimized nature, and it uses a 1mm 3-pin JST connector for the battery. But interestingly enough, Pulsar isn't advertising any estimated runtimes for the Xlite Crazylight, nor did they do this for the X2 CL, so I don't have any official estimates to compare my data to, but regardless, my Xlite CL on firmware version 3.03, the mouse's DPI set to its max of 32,000, the base LED enabled and set to static, auto sleep, ripple, angle snapping, turbo mode, and motion sync all disabled, and the mouse placed on a jiggler to simulate constant use. On 1kHz the mouse lasted only 48 hours, on 2kHz it lasted around 29 hours, on 4kHz it lasted around 18 hours, and on 8kHz it only lasted 15 hours. Now these values are at best underwhelming, being very similar to the battery life we saw in the X2 CL, and these estimated runtimes pale in comparison to mice from other brands like G-Wolves such as the Fender series mice, which also use a 3950, a 52840, and a 200mAh battery, and have an estimated runtime of approximately 92 hours on 1kHz, which is almost double the battery life here on the Crazylight. After seeing this runtime, I understand why Pulsar isn't advertising any runtimes for the Crazylight series mice, and they have been quite underwhelming. Hopefully in the future we'll see Pulsar optimize the mouse's firmware to make the Crazylight series runtime a little more competitive with other mice on the market, but seeing how the battery life hasn't improved much from the X2 Crazylight, it looks like we'll be waiting a little while for some more battery life here. I also wanted to mention that since Pulsar has recently added their turbo mode to all of their mice, which is the same as the similar performance modes we've seen on many other mice lately, which locks the sensor's frame rate to 20k FPS to marginally improve the mouse's performance, enabling this feature will further reduce the runtime on the Xlite Crazylight by a few hours, so keep this in mind. For software, the Xlite Crazylight has two available options, a locally installable one and Pulsar's WebDriver. Unfortunately though, many features, including the ability to tilt the Xlite sensor, is only adjustable via the WebDriver, so while it's nice to see two types of software available for the Xlite Crazylight, Pulsar should match the functionality of both versions so users who don't have access to the internet can take advantage of some of the more advanced features here on the Crazylight. Now I've already talked about the installable software when I reviewed the X2 Crazylight, so I'm only going to focus on the WebDriver today as it's newer. Now I've talked about Pulsar's WebDriver, which they call Bib and Bap, before when I reviewed the PC MK2HE, but since that review the driver has changed a lot, which is why I want to talk about it today. Now as expected for a WebDriver, it only works on Chromium based browsers such as Edge, Chrome, etc, so make sure to use a supported browser if you're going to use the WebDriver. And once you've navigated to the WebDriver's URL, which will be linked down in the video description for you, and once you go to the URL you'll be prompted to select your device. Now at first you might not notice it, but the Crazylight series is listed here, it just shows the X2 TLPRX edition as its placeholder, but once you click on the Crazylight series, you'll be prompted to connect the mouse with a big button on the page, and then you can select the mouse from the drop-down menu, and once it's connected, you'll load into the WebDriver. Now, the WebDriver is divided into a tab system featuring 5 separate tabs. However, on every tab there will be an overlay of sorts with a connectivity and battery readout at the bottom left, but for some reason the battery percentage doesn't show unless you hover your mouse over the battery icon, which is strange. I'd much rather see a percentage readout, and hopefully we'll see Pulsar adjust this soon. Also on this overlay there is a language selector at the top right, and below that there is a profile selector on which you can toggle the Xlite's 4 onboard profiles, and there's also a button at the bottom on which you can reset an individual profile, which is nice to see, and there's also another reset button at the bottom of the page which does the same thing as the one in the tab profile. Now, aside from the overlay, the first tab is called the Customize tab, where you can customize the button actions on the Xlite Crazylight. Thankfully, there are a lot of rebind options here, including an option to rebind a button such as the wheel click to swap the mouse's profiles, which is a great feature many brands still don't support for some reason. In the next tab called Performance, you can adjust the mouse's DPI range, set the number of DPI stages between 1 and 6. You can adjust the base DPI LED indicator between on, off, static, and breathing, and there are also settings for the light's brightness and speed as well, and you can also change the color of these individual levels by clicking on the colored box next to their names. Below that, you can adjust the mouse's polling rates and the LOD levels between 0.71 and 2 millimeters, and below that we finally have the sensor tilt setting, which was missing on the X2 CL, which I'm very happy to see, but again you can only adjust this via the WebDriver as the installable software cannot adjust this, which is disappointing. And lastly, at the bottom of the page we have toggles for motion sync, ripple, angle snapping, and turbo mode, as well as a debounce filter which is adjustable from 0 to 18 milliseconds and defaults to 2 milliseconds. Next we have the macro tab, which is pretty self-explanatory, and we also have a tab called Power and Dongle, in which you can adjust the battery percentage at which the low power mode will kick in, just as you can on Razor's mice. And as I mentioned earlier, we have options for the dongle LED, which as I mentioned earlier is very distracting in its default mode, and thankfully you can adjust this behavior or change its mode, but hopefully in the future Pulsar adds a way to dim the LED as well, as it's very bright. Finally, we have the settings tab, in which we can see the mel0n dongle's firmware versions that update them if needed. There is also a button to repair the dongle, a link to Pulsar's support page, and a button to fully factory reset the mouse to its default settings, and if you click this button it does bring up a confirmation page, which is a nice feature. For repairability, the Xlite, just like the X2 Crazylight and Pulsar's previous mice, is a decently serviceable mouse. The shell is a little trickier to open than we've seen on Pulsar's previous mice, but with the right tools it's relatively easy to open. On the inside, the layout and design are quite similar to what we saw in the X2 CL, just shaped differently due to the ergonomic design, but it remains quite serviceable, so repairing, modding, or cleaning the mouse will be relatively easy, which I'm very happy to see. And if you want to learn more about how to fully disassemble the Xlite, see how the mouse is designed on the inside, and learn more about the mouse's individual component weights and much more, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the Xlite Crazylight's teardown video, which will be releasing very soon. For stock skates, as I mentioned earlier, the Xlite comes with 2 kinds of skates, the pre-installed full-size PTFE skates and 16 of Pulsar's UHMWPE skates. First, let's talk about the good, which is the pre-installed stock skates. Just like the X2 Crazylight stock skates, the ones here in the Xlite Crazylight are traditional 100% PTFE skates with the typical larger surface area base skate and a slightly smaller surface area top skate and a sensor ring. Now, these skates performed quite well during my testing, at least on fabric pads, and I had no particular issue with their performance. However, I did notice that the adhesive layer bled quite a bit around the skate, specifically around the sensor ring, which led to a lot of debris from the mousepad building up around the skates. This isn't an issue I had in the previous Pulsar mice, which is a little odd, but despite this, the stock skates are quite good, and my only complaint aside from the adhesive bleeding is that the mouse doesn't include an extra set of full-size PTFE skates in the box. Now let's talk about the bad, these UHMWPE dot skates. Now, to be fair to Pulsar, I love the idea of including a hard pad optimized skate with the mouse, so bravo to them, but these are just awful skates. While their 6.6 by 0.9 millimeter sizing is good, for some reason Pulsar opted not to round the edges of these skates, shipping them as cylindrical skates instead of rounded ones. To their credit, this isn't a terrible idea, at least on paper, as the flattened surface gives the skates a larger surface area and more controlled, which makes sense since they are designed to be used on a hard pad, but because these edges aren't rounded, these skates are not only very scratchy, particularly on more textured hard pads, they're also extremely loud as they lack a buffering layer. Now, to be fair, once worked in, they do become a little quieter and they're usable. That's really the best thing I could say about them, but these skates are only usable for hard pads. You cannot use them on fabric pads due to their sharper edges, as that will interfere with the weaving on many fabric pad types. So while I'm happy to see Pulsar include some form of hard pad optimized skate, these skates are just very outdated, and they are essentially a worse version of the now discontinued X-Ray Pad Obsidian Pro skates, and as such you'll be much better off using the pre-installed stock skates on hard pads even though they aren't optimized for hard pad use, as they'll feel much better compared to these MWPE skates. In all honesty though, if these skates were rounded and had some kind of dampening layer on them, they'd be really good, but compared to more modern offerings such as the X-Ray Pad Air or Ultra Series skates, as well as the Unusual Way Sports Silver or Black Fox skates, all of which are rounded and feature foam dampening layers, these dots feel like a Stone Age tool compared to other hard pad optimized skates on the market. But while the Xlite's included skates are a bit of a mixed bag, one positive aspect to the Xlite skates is that they are very easy to remove, as Pulsar has installed skate removal ramps on the mouse's base. To their credit, the skate channels themselves are also very shallow, meaning that every kind of aftermarket skate, even thinner ones, will be compatible with the Xlite Crazylight, which is another great attention to detail. Lastly, let's talk about the Xlite Crazylight stock cable. Now, I've always been a big fan of Pulsar stock cables, specifically the ones in the X2 V2 and the X2H, as they are the perfect stock cable in my eyes. And while the Crazylight stock cable is similar to the ones we've seen Pulsar use before, there have been some changes that make it slightly worse. Now, the stock cable is still a USB A to C with the same tilted USB-C end we saw in the X2 series stock cables, which I'm very happy to see return, but the cable has a slightly rougher paracord wrapping, rougher than the wrappings we've seen in the X2 series cables, and it's also worth noting that the Crazylight cable is thicker than the older cables and much more rigid. Now, the cable is just thin enough to be usable with a bungee like the Pulsar ES bungee, but its rigidity makes the cable less than ideal for wired use, unlike the older X2 series cables that were perfect for wired use due to their flexibility. Now, since the Xlite Crazylight only has 1 kHz on its wired connectivity, the thicker, more rigid cable isn't the biggest issue, as you won't be using the Crazylight wired unless you're charging it, but the cable itself is a downgrade from the older X2 series cables in my opinion. Again, this is not a deal breaker by any means, but I really would love to see Pulsar's older X2 cables return, as they were perfect. But I will say, despite the rigidity in the wrapping, this stock cable is better than most of my stock cables due to its tilted USB-C end, something that a lot of brands miss on their stock cables. And just to reiterate something I said earlier, due to the stock cable's weight, it can slightly unbalance the Xlite, making it slightly forward heavy. This won't necessarily impact your performance on the mouse when using it wired, but the slight front heaviness might make it somewhat heavier in some cases, so again, I would recommend using the mouse wireless, and I wouldn't recommend using it wired. Alright, well, in closing, overall the Xlite Crazylight, while not necessarily a bad mouse, is a confusing one. While the mouse's weight is good, being about 7.4 grams lighter than the standard Xlite counterparts, and while it also has great build quality, it has great click implementations, great stock skates, and great compatibility with aftermarket skates, as well as a very good WebDriver implementation, the mouse's weight, while good, isn't advertised properly, as my unit is 1.6 grams heavier with both types of the included skates. The mouse can be easily unbalanced by heavier stock cables like the stock one, which can't impact wired performance. The mouse is also capped to 1 kHz on its wired connectivity and has a horrible scroll wheel encoder that is extremely loose, feeling the same as a 2-year-old worn-in encoder. The mouse's battery life and runtime is subpar compared to other mice with similar specs from other competitors. The stock skates, while they do perform well, did leak a lot of adhesive, especially around the sensor ring, and the mouse doesn't include any additional PTFE skates, and the included MWPE dot skates are the worst hardpad optimized skates I've used to date, and the WebDriver, while being well implemented, has more features than the installable software, meaning if you don't have access to the internet, you can't adjust some of the settings on the mouse, which is a big issue. So weighing all these pros and cons, the Xlite Crazylight is kind of pointless in my opinion, as the Xlite V3 and V4 series mice, while being heavier, offer the same or better degree of performance with much better battery life and much better scroll wheels, which makes the Xlite Crazylight tricky for me to recommend, as it's hard to justify purchasing it for for its lower weight when Pulsar already offers better versions in the form of the Xlite V3 and V4, which on top of the benefits I just mentioned also come in mini, large, and medium sizes, while the Xlite Crazylight is only available in a mini size. So while Pulsar's latest release in the Crazy lineup is a bit of a miss in my opinion, the future does look a little brighter as patent filings and certifications have popped up for an X3 Crazylight as well as an X2H Crazylight, which is very exciting as the X2H is their best shape in my opinion, and hopefully Pulsar can learn from their mistakes with the Xlite Crazylight and make their future Crazylight series mice much better with improved scroll wheels and better battery runtimes, but we'll have to wait and see how these new Crazylight series mice fare. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you again to Pulsar for sending over the Xlite Crazylight for review, I greatly appreciate it, and big thank you to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you would like to support my efforts here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, and channel members get early access to all upcoming content here on the channel. So if you want to see new episodes of the mel0n Review or Teardown before anyone else, become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the Pulsar Xlite Crazylight, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.